Hey there, fellow horror enthusiasts. Welcome back to Real Talk Horror Edition, your go-to podcast for all things terrifying, chilling, and spine-tingling in the world of cinema. I'm your host, Josh Bell, and I'm thrilled to have you join me on this extra special Christmas Eve episode where we're going to dive into the dark and twisted corners of my favorite horror film of all time. Together, we'll unravel the mysteries of what makes a horror film unforgettable, whether it's a bone-chilling masterpiece or a gruesome misstep that leaves our heads scratching. So grab your popcorn, let's turn down the lights, and let's get into it. Here on the Real Talk Horror Edition, we don't just talk about horror films, we dive deep into them. Each week, like right now, we're diving in and analyzing each movie in John Carpenter's filmography and taking it apart piece by piece. We explore the plot, the characters, the cinematography, the sound design, and even the themes hiding beneath the surface. We're here to ask the important questions. What makes a good scare work? Why do certain films haunt us? And perhaps most importantly, how do some films miss the mark entirely? Whether you're a casual horror fan or a diehard, there's something here for everyone. As I mentioned, today's episode is a special one. We are going to talk about a film that forever changed the face of horror cinema. That's right, the 1974 classic Texas Chainsaw Massacre. This is a film that can only be defined as era-changing, genre-redefining, and it showed what horror could be. It's raw, it's visceral, and it's terrifying. Over the next several minutes, we're going to explore what makes this film such a landmark in the genre, from its intense, almost unbearable tension to its groundbreaking cinematography and sound design. This is a movie that still resonates with audiences nearly 50 years. Actually, we're at 50 years this year after its release. But we're not just looking at it through rose-colored glasses. We'll also talk about how it holds up today, its influence on modern horror, and some of the controversies that have surrounded it over the years. So whether you are a first-time listener or you've seen this movie 100 times, stick around. There is plenty to sink your teeth into. And hey, before we jump into the chainsaw-wielding madness, a quick reminder. This show is all about conversation. If you've got thoughts on Texas Chainsaw Massacre, whether you loved it, hated it, or you fall somewhere in between, I want to hear from you. Share your insights and keep this horror community alive and screaming. Head on over to Instagram or Threads. Those are the only two that I really participate in, and we're just there at Real Talk. All right, enough talk. Let's fire up the chainsaw and get into the raw terror of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Here we go. So let's dive into this twisted world that is the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. First, let's set the stage with a quick rundown. Released in 1974 and directed by the now legendary Tobe Hooper, this film is often credited as one of the most influential horror movies of all time. But what's it about? On the surface, the plot is pretty straightforward. But trust me, there is nothing simple about the horror it delivers. Here's the setup. A group of 5 young friends set out on a road trip across the sprawling, sun-scorched highways of rural Texas. They're carefree, adventurous, and maybe just a little too trusting for their own good. Their trip starts innocently enough, with stops at a dilapidated gas station and detours to explore an abandoned family home. But things take a dark and twisted turn when they cross paths with something far more sinister than they could have imagined. A family of deranged cannibals with a taste for blood and power tools. At the center of the chaos is Leatherface, a towering figure who wields his chainsaw like an extension of his body. He's not your average slasher villain. He's a whirlwind of terror, made even more unnerving by his grotesque skin mask disguise. But what truly sets this movie apart is the way it strips away any sense of safety or predictability. From the moment the horror begins, it doesn't let up. There's no savior coming, no safe haven to run to. The characters, and us in the audience, are trapped in a relentless nightmare. Tobe Hooper's direction here is nothing short of brilliant. He uses the isolation of the Texas countryside to create a very oppressive atmosphere. The vast, empty landscapes aren't just a backdrop. They're a constant reminder of just how far away help really is. The rural setting, combined with the gritty, documentary-like filmmaking style, gives the movie an unsettling sense of realism. You don't feel like you're watching a horror film. You feel like you've stumbled into a real-life nightmare. And yet, for all its terror, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre isn't gratuitously gory. It's a film that relies more on what it suggests than what it shows, letting your imagination fill in the blanks. This restraint only adds to the tension. Every creak of the floorboards, every rev of the chainsaw, and every desperate scream feels magnified, pulling you deeper into the horror. To sum it up, this isn't just a story about survival. It's a story about the absolute breakdown of normalcy and the sheer unpredictability of human depravity. It's raw, it's relentless, and it's unforgettable. Whether you're watching it for the first time or revisiting it again and again, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre continues to stand as a testament to what horror can achieve when it's done right. And that's just scratching the surface. From here, we'll dive into the film's plot structure, its unforgettable characters, and the deeper themes it explores. But for now, I'll say this. If you haven't seen this movie yet, you are in for one wild, terrifying ride. I suggest pausing this show right now, running out, watching it, and then coming back to finish up with us. Let's talk about the narrative backbone of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. One of the film's greatest strengths is in its simplicity. At the core is a straightforward story of a group of friends stumbling into the wrong place at the wrong time and paying an absolutely horrific price for it. There are no convoluted subplots, no extraneous characters, just a relentless march into terror. And yet within the simplicity lies an incredible depth of suspense and tension that few films have ever been able to replicate. The structure of the film is as tight as a drum. From the moment our group encounters the eerie hitchhiker early on, there's a sense that things are spiraling out of control. Each scene is meticulously crafted to propel the story forward, building on the mounting dread. There are no wasted moments. Even the quieter scenes are laced with unease. Whether it's the creaking of an old swing, or the wind, or the unsettling conversations at the gas station, every second feels like a precursor to something terrible. Now, what really sets this film apart is that unflinching realism. Unlike most horror films of its time, or even today, there's no supernatural force at play here. No ghosts, no demonic entities, no unkillable monsters. This horror is entirely human, and that's what makes it so gut-wrenching. The story is rooted in the depravity of mankind, showing us the most terrifying monsters are the ones that walk among us. This grounded approach gives the film an authenticity that makes the horror hit even harder. Tobe Hooper's direction shines in his ability to build tension to almost unbearable levels. He uses long, agonizing moments of silence or stillness to draw us in, forcing us to sit with our own discomfort. You're never quite sure when the next burst of violence will erupt, And when it does, it feels like a release of all the tension that's just been simmering below the surface. This is an absolute masterclass in pacing. Hooper knows exactly when to dial up the chaos and when to pull back, letting the dread settle back in. And let's talk about the violence, or rather the lack of. One of the most fascinating aspects of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is how restrained it is when it comes to gore. Despite its reputation as one of the most brutal horror films ever made, there's remarkably little blood on screen. This was a deliberate choice by Hooper, and it pays off in spades. By leaving much of the violence to the imagination, the film becomes even more unsettling. Your mind fills in the gaps, often conjuring up something far worse than anything the filmmakers could have shown. Another key element of the unpredictability of the plot. Unlike many horror films that follow a familiar formula, this one keeps you guessing. The story doesn't adhere to a conventional structure. There's no clear build-up to a climactic showdown, no tidy resolution. Instead, it feels chaotic, almost random, like real life. The absence of traditional narrative beats adds to the film's sense of disorientation and helplessness, mirroring what the characters themselves are experiencing. In the end, the plot is a reminder that sometimes less is more. It's a lean, efficient narrative that never wastes time on unnecessary exposition or melodrama. It plunges you into a nightmare and does not let you go. And that simplicity, paired with its raw execution, is what makes this a standout, not just in the horror genre, but in cinema as a whole. Let's move on to the characters and performances in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, because they are an essential part of what makes this film so impactful. Now, this isn't a movie filled with household names or seasoned Hollywood veterans, but that's precisely what makes it work. The one caveat to this is John Larroquette as the narrator at the beginning. He will go on to be the only person that you recognize from other films later down the line. But it's this authenticity that the cast brings, and this rawness that feels less like acting and more like they're watching real people spiral into terror. Let's start with Marilyn Burns, who plays our protagonist and one of the most iconic final girls in horror history, Sally Hardesty. Sally isn't the kind of polished, hyper-competent heroine we often see in modern horror. Instead, she's a young woman who's thrown into this unimaginable nightmare, and her fight for survival feels visceral and genuine. Burns delivers a performance that can only be described as harrowing. You don't just see her fear, you feel it. Her screams, her frantic attempts to escape, her sheer desperation, they're all so authentic that they stay with us long after the film is over. There's a particular scene near the end where Sally is bound at the family dinner table that captures her descent into pure primal survival instinct. It is one of the most gut-wrenching moments in horror cinema, and Marilyn Burns carries it with incredible intensity. But Sally's not the only character who leaves a lasting impression. Let's talk about the antagonists, the Sawyer family. They're not your typical cookie-cutter horror villains. Each family member is uniquely deranged, bringing a different flavor of terror to the table. And at the center of it all, of course, is Leatherface. Played by Gunnar Hansen, Leatherface isn't just a mindless killing machine. There's a strange, almost tragic complexity to him. He's childlike in some ways, but utterly terrifying in his unpredictability. The way he moves, the way he wields his chainsaw with reckless abandon, it all adds up to create a character who's as unforgettable as he is horrifying. And what's interesting about Leatherface is that he doesn't speak. His character is communicated entirely through his actions, his guttural sounds, and his body language. This silence or lack of words makes him all the more menacing. You can't reason with him. You can't plead for mercy. He's like a force of nature, chaotic and unstoppable. Then there's the rest of the Sawyer clan. Each one of them brings something uniquely unsettling to the film. The hitchhiker, played by Edwin Neal, is a standout for me. From the moment he steps on screen, you can tell there's something deeply wrong with him. He's unpredictable, erratic, and just downright creepy. A perfect introduction to the horrors that await. Then we have the gas station owner, referred to as the cook, played by Jim Sedow. At first, he seems like a friendly, if slightly odd, local, but as his true nature is revealed, he becomes just as terrifying as the rest of the family. What's so chilling about the cook is how normal he seems on the surface, which makes his descent into madness even more shocking. The dynamic between the Sawyers is something I find particularly fascinating. They're not just a family of killers. They're a dysfunctional, chaotic unit. There's a twisted sense of hierarchy and routine in their madness, which makes them feel even more real. They're not caricatures or one-note villains. These are fully fleshed out nightmares in human form. And we can't overlook the rest of the supporting cast. The other members of Sally's group, while not as memorable as the main players, they serve their roles well in setting up the stakes. Their performances may not stand out individually, but collectively they help to establish the normalcy that's so violently shattered by the events of the film. What's remarkable about the acting in Texas Chainsaw Massacre is how unpolished it feels. And I mean that in the best way possible. These performances don't feel like actors playing characters. They feel like real people caught in a horrific situation. That authenticity elevates the film's sense of realism and makes the terror all the more immersive. In the end, the cast of Texas Chainsaw Massacre delivers performances that are raw, unfiltered, and unforgettable. Whether it's Marilyn Burns' gut-wrenching portrayal of Sally, Gunnar Hansen's towering and terrifying Leatherface, or the grotesque dynamics of the Sawyer family, these characters will stay with you, and in a genre that often struggles with creating memorable characters, that is no small feat. Now let's take a moment to peel back the layers of Texas Chainsaw Massacre and dig into its themes and symbolism. Because as much as it is a visceral horror film, it's also a rich tapestry of commentary on society, human nature, and even the world of the 1970s. One of the film's most prominent themes is isolation, and the story's rural Texas setting is more than just a backstop here. It's a character in and of itself. These wide open spaces, the desolate roads, and the eerie stillness of the countryside create a profound sense of being cut off from the rest of the world. There's no bustling town nearby, no helpful strangers to turn to, just vast emptiness. For the group of young travelers, it's as if they've entered another world entirely, one where the rules of civilization no longer apply. This isolation heightens the terror because it's not just the Sawyer family they're up against. It's the sheer hopelessness of their environment. Then there's the theme of human depravity, which sits at the very heart of the film. The Sawyer family isn't driven by supernatural forces or ancient curses. These are ordinary people who have descended into the darkest corners of humanity. Their cannibalistic lifestyle and grotesque rituals aren't just horrifying on the surface level. They force us to confront the unsettling idea that the true monsters are not otherworldly creatures, but people who have been warped by their circumstances. In a sense, the Sawyers are a distorted mirror held up to society, reflecting the potential for cruelty and madness within all of us. But it doesn't stop there. Even Leatherface's infamous chainsaw carries a deeper symbolic weight. On one level, it's a terrifying weapon, embodying chaos and violence. But on another level, it's a tool of labor that has been twisted into an instrument of death. This transformation speaks to the film's underlying theme of the clash between the industrial and the human. Consider the context of the 1970s, when America was grappling with the fallout of industrialization, economic instability, and a shifting cultural landscape. The Sawyer family, once part of the slaughterhouse industry, represents those who have been left behind by progress, forced to adapt in horrifying ways. The chainsaw, in this sense, becomes a symbol of how industrial tools, when wielded by the wrong hands, can strip away humanity and turn people into something monstrous. Another layer of symbolism lies in the way the film addresses the idea of the family unit. At first glance, the Sawyers might seem like a perverse mockery of the traditional family, but there's more to it than that. They have their own twisted hierarchy, their own rituals, and even a sense of loyalty to one another. It's disturbing because it forces us to question what truly separates a normal family from one like theirs. Are they a product of their environment, or are they inherently evil? This ambiguity adds depth to their characters and makes the horror feel all the more unsettling. The film also touches on themes of powerlessness and survival. The protagonists are young, carefree, and full of life in the beginning. But as the story unfolds, their sense of control is stripped away, piece by piece. By the time we reach the climax, Sally's fight for survival becomes primal and animalistic, a stark contrast to the civilized world she came from. This transformation speaks to the idea that when pushed to the brink, humanity can revert to its most basic instincts. It's a chilling commentary on how fragile our sense of safety and identity really are. And let's not overlook the symbolic use of the film's setting. The decaying farmhouse, the bone-filled rooms, and even the eerie, isolated roads. These visuals serve as metaphors for decay, and not just physical decay, but societal and moral decay as well. The farmhouse, with its grotesque decorations made of human remains, is like a physical manifestation of the family's warped psyche. It's a space where the line between the human and the inhuman has been obliterated, reflecting the film's broader themes of degradation and loss. Lastly, there's something to be said about the film's exploration of fear of the unknown. The Sawyers are horrifying because they exist outside the realm of normal experience. There's no reasoning with them, no understanding their motives. They're alien in their cruelty, yet disturbingly human. This taps into a primal fear that many of us share. The fear of encountering something or someone that operates on an entirely different set of rules, with no regard for your own sense of morality or humanity. In the end, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre isn't just a film about survival or horror. It's a deeply, deeply layered exploration of societal anxieties and human fragility. It is a reminder that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones that live closest to home. If there's one aspect of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre that deserves special attention, it's the cinematography and visuals. Tobe Hooper and cinematographer Daniel Pearl crafted a visual language that doesn't just show us horror, it forces us to live it. The way this film looks and feels is a huge part of why it has stayed burned into our minds and the minds of horror fans for 50 years. One of the most striking choices in the film is the raw, documentary-like realism. Hooper's use of natural light, handheld cameras, minimalist artificial enhancement gives the movie an unsettlingly authentic feel, as if we've stumbled upon a snuff film, capturing events that shouldn't be seen. This gritty aesthetic isn't just a stylistic choice, it's a deliberate tactic to pull you into the world of the story. The lack of polish makes every scene feel uncomfortably real, amplifying the tension and horror. Take, for example, the film's daytime sequences. Unlike many horror films that rely on the cover of darkness, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre often unfolds in broad daylight. This subversion of expectations is unsettling because it robs us of the usual comfort of thinking, the sun is up, so we're safe. The harsh, glaring Texas sun casts long shadows and bathes everything in an oppressive, almost sickly light. It creates a juxtaposition where the horror isn't hiding in the dark. It's out in the open, unavoidable, and unrelenting. And then there's the way the camera moves. The handheld style immerses us in the chaos, makes us feel like we're part of the group, trapped in this nightmare. Hooper and Pearl often opt for long, agonizing shots that refuse to cut away, forcing us to endure the tension alongside the characters. This technique is particularly effective during the dinner scene, where the camera lingers on Sally's terrified face, locking us into her suffering and making escape feel impossible. One of the most unforgettable visual moments in the film, and a testament to its genius, is the low-angle tracking shot of Pam walking toward the house. The camera glides along the ground, capturing her in profile as she approaches the ominous Sawyer home. It's a stunning shot framed against the stark Texas sky that immediately builds dread. There's an unspoken sense that something is horribly wrong even before she steps inside. The house looms large and menacing, again practically a character in itself, and the low angle emphasizes her vulnerability and the inescapable danger ahead. This is the ultimate in visual storytelling, foreshadowing her fate without a single word of dialogue. Another standout visual element is the grotesque set design, particularly inside the Sawyer home. From the bone furniture to the macabre decorations made from human remains, every detail of the environment reinforces the depravity of the family. The close-up shots of these objects linger just long enough to make you squirm, forcing you to confront the twisted world these characters inhabit. The house isn't just a setting, it's a reflection of the family's fractured psyche and a physical manifestation of the film's themes of decay and madness. The film also uses tight, claustrophobic framing to trap us. When the characters are inside the home, the walls seem to close in around them, emphasizing their helplessness. The camera often isolates them in the frame, cutting them off from any sense of safety or escape. This oppressive visual style mirrors the character's mental state as the world collapses into chaos. And let's not forget the use of light and shadow. This interplay between the two is expertly handled, particularly in the scenes set at dusk or inside the house. The harsh, flickering light of the generator contrasts with the deep, impenetrable shadows, creating an atmosphere of unease. You're never quite sure what's lurking just out of sight, and it's that uncertainty that is so terrifying. It's as terrifying as anything the Sawyers actually do on screen. The cinematography and visuals of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre aren't just a backdrop, they're an integral part of the storytelling. Every shot, every angle, every frame is designed to pull you deeper into the nightmare. Hooper and Pearl didn't just create a film, they created an experience, one that will stay with you long after the credits roll, and it's a testament to how powerful visual storytelling can be and why this film remains a benchmark in horror cinema. One of the most overlooked yet crucial aspects of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is its sound design. This isn't just a movie you watch, it's a movie you hear in your bones. From the iconic roar of the chainsaw to the eerie silence that punctuates moments of dread, sound is a driving force behind the film's ability to terrify. First, let's talk about the chainsaw itself. It's more than a tool in Leatherface's hands. It's a character in its own right, an extension of Leatherface. The sound of the chainsaw revving, sputtering, roaring is like a relentless predator. It doesn't just signal danger, it embodies it. That mechanical growl worms its way into your psyche, triggering a primal fear of being hunted. There's a reason this sound has become so synonymous with horror. It's raw, loud, and inescapable, and it perfectly mirrors the chaos and brutality of the events unfolding on screen. But what's just as powerful as the sound itself is the use of silence. Hooper understood that sometimes what you don't hear can be just as terrifying as what you do. Key moments in the film are stripped of any traditional score, leaving you with only the ambient sounds of the environment. The creak of a door, the rustle of wind through the trees, the distant hum of a generator, it's all so stark and unsettling. This absence of music creates a sense of realism that makes the horror feel all the more immediate, as if you've stumbled into a walking nightmare and there's no dramatic orchestra to signal when to brace yourself. The silence forces you to sit with the tension, and in doing so, it becomes a weapon of fear. Then there's the deliberate chaos of the film's soundscape. Instead of a polished orchestral score, Hooper and sound designer Wayne Bell opted for bursts of discordant noise that defy traditional musical structure. These sounds, metallic screeches, guttural growls, and distorted hums all feel alien and unnatural, and they amplify the film's sense of madness. It's like the world itself is breaking apart under the weight of the horror. These sounds don't soothe or guide you. They jolt you out of your comfort zone, and they keep you as disoriented and vulnerable as the characters. Take the infamous dinner scene, for instance. This cacophony of clinking utensils, maniacal laughter, and Sally's desperate screams create an auditory assault that's almost unbearable. It's not just the visuals that make this scene so disturbing. It's the relentless, overwhelming sound that traps you in the chaos. You're not just watching Sally break down, you're experiencing it with her, thanks to the way the sound design mirrors her spiraling terror. Even in moments where there is music, it's far from conventional. The film uses fragmented, atonal compositions that feel more like noise than melody. These bursts of sound act as emotional triggers, heightening the unease without giving you the release that a traditional score might provide. It's music designed not to comfort, but to unnerve. There's no sweeping theme to latch onto, just jagged, unsettling audio that keeps you on edge. The contrast between sound and silent is another masterstroke. Moments of quiet are often shattered by sudden jarring noises, creating a rhythm of tension and release that's anything but predictable. This technique keeps you guessing, never allowing you to settle into a comfortable pattern. You're constantly on edge, waiting for the next auditory attack. Finally, the ambient sounds of the rural Texas setting playing a crucial role in grounding the horror. The whir of insects, the distant barking of dogs, and the ominous hum of machinery all create a sense of place that's both familiar and deeply unsettling. These sounds anchor you in the reality of the world, making the horror feel even more plausible. In many ways, the sound design of Texas Chainsaw Massacre is as iconic as its visuals. It's not just there to support the story, it is the story, weaving its way into every corner of the film and amplifying the terror at every turn. Hooper and Bell created a soundscape that doesn't just accompany the horror, it heightens it, leaving its own mark on the genre. A testament to how powerful sound can be in shaping an experience, and why this film remains a masterclass in using every element of filmmaking to terrify its audience. Now, there's another thing Texas Chainsaw Massacre does wonderfully, and that's pulling you into its nightmare and refusing to let go. The pacing of the film is a key reason it remains such a horror classic. From the moment the terror begins, it becomes this relentless, suffocating experience that doesn't allow you or the characters any moment to breathe. The first half of the movie builds tension with a creeping sense of dread. Hooper takes his time to establish the eerie, isolated Texas setting, which feels as much a character as the people in the story. The slow unraveling of the plot lulls you into a false sense of security, giving you just enough time to feel connected to the characters before everything spirals into chaos. This deliberate pacing in the early scenes serves a dual purpose. It immerses us in the world of the film while making the eventual descent into terror even more shocking. But once the horror kicks in, it's like a switch is flipped. The second half of the movie is a non-stop barrage of tension, fear, and outright panic. The pacing becomes relentless, mirroring the breathless desperation of Sally and the other victims as they try and fail to escape their nightmare. Each encounter with Leatherface and the Sawyer family ratchets up the intensity, leaving no room for comfort or safety. It's a relentless march toward madness, and the audience is dragged along every step of the way. One of the most impressive aspects of the pacing is how it uses time to its advantage. Scenes that would typically feel short or transitional in other films are stretched out, forcing us to endure the suspense. For example, the moment when Pam stumbles into the bone-filled room is drawn out just long enough for us to process the sheer horror of what she's seeing. We're given time to feel her fear, which makes her inevitable capture even more harrowing. The editing plays an equally crucial role in maintaining this unyielding tension. Hooper and editor Larry Carroll employ a raw, almost chaotic style of cutting that feels jarring but intentional. This is particularly evident in the infamous dinner scene we've talked about numerous times, but here the editing becomes an assault on the senses. The rapid cuts between Sally's terrified screams, the maniacal laughter of the Sawyer family, and the close-ups of grotesque details like Grandpa's decaying face create a sense of overwhelming hysteria. It's disorienting, maddening, and perfectly mirrors Sally's own psychological unraveling. What's brilliant about the editing is how it balances this chaos with moments of unnerving stillness. Just when you think the terror can't get any worse, the film slows down to linger on a disturbing image or sound. These moments of eerie quiet, like Leatherface's almost methodical preparation of his victims, are just as horrifying as the frenzied action. They give the audience a moment to catch our breath, but not in a way that feels comforting. Instead, it's like the calm before a storm, making the next burst of violence more impactful. The film also uses editing to play with our sense of time. The chaotic events feel endless, as if you're trapped in the nightmare along with Sally. By the time the film ends, you feel as exhausted and battered as the characters themselves. This manipulation of pacing and time is a true testament to Hooper's skill as a filmmaker. It is not just about what happens. It's about how it's delivered to us in the audience. The final chase sequence is relentlessly paced. From Sally's desperate escape from the house to her frantic run through the woods, the editing keeps us on edge, cutting between her panicked expression and Leatherface's relentless pursuit. The frenetic energy of these scenes is palpable, leaving us breathless by the time she makes it to the road, and even then, the film refuses to let us fully relax. Ending with a climatic burst of chaos, it leaves us stunned. In many ways, the pacing and editing are as much a part of the horror as the story itself. They work hand in hand to create the experience that feels unrelenting and inescapable and immerse us in this world of terror that lingers long after you've finished watching this film. It's this precise, almost surgical manipulation of time and rhythm that makes this film such a visceral and unforgettable ride. Now, one of the most fascinating aspects of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is how it redefines what true horror is. It's not about cheap, jump scare thrills you might expect from many modern horror films. Rather, it's about building an atmosphere so thick with dread that you feel suffocated by it. The movie doesn't need to rely on loud noises or sudden shocks to make you flinch. Its terror comes from the slow, deliberate construction of fear. From its tension-filled silences to the unrelenting discomfort of its world. From the moment the film begins, you're thrust into a nightmare where nothing feels safe. Hooper's genius lies in how he makes every scene feel like it could spiral into violence at any second, but never fully lets us in the audience relax. Instead of relying on predictable jump scares, the tension continuously ratchets up through the careful manipulation of pacing, visuals, and sound. This method keeps us on edge, always waiting for the next shoe to drop, unsure of where or when the horror will strike next. The feeling that danger is always lurking just around the corner is a constant undercurrent throughout the film, making every scene feel dangerous, even when nothing particularly violent is happening. Now let's address one of the film's most widely discussed aspects, its gore, or more accurately, its lack of it. Despite being known as one of the most terrifying and brutal horror films ever made, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is surprisingly restrained when it comes to explicit gore. Sure, there are some grisly moments, but Hooper doesn't make the mistake of turning his movie into a blood-soaked spectacle. This is where the brilliance of the film truly shines. In the era that followed, the slasher era, films like Friday the 13th and Halloween would amp up the gore factor, using graphic violence to shock and provoke a reaction from the audience. But Texas Chainsaw Massacre takes the opposite approach. Hooper understands that what you don't see can be just as terrifying, if not more so, than what's explicitly shown. Instead of lingering on the bloody aftermath of a murder or assault, the film often cuts away just before the moment of violence hits. This technique forces your mind to fill in the gruesome details, and that's where the true horror lies. By withholding the worst images, the film lets our imaginations run wild, and it makes us complicit in the terror. We end up imagining far worse than what could have been shown on screen, and that's what makes it so effective. Take, for instance, the first encounter with Leatherface when he violently hits Kirk with a sledgehammer. We don't see the blow in detail. What we see is Kirk's body dropping to the floor, the door slamming shut, and the guttural sounds of Leatherface as he drags the body away. The action is fast and jarring, and you're left to fill in the gaps with your own mind, which is far more brutal than any graphic image could be. The way Hooper handles the gore in these scenes is almost poetic. By not showing us the full horror, he allows us to use our imagination and run wild with possibilities. And it leaves us far more disturbed than if we'd been shown every grisly detail. Then there's the dinner scene, one of the most infamous in horror history. Raw physical terror of this scene doesn't come from overt violence, but from constant grinding tension. Sally is trapped with the family, subjected to their warped sadistic behavior. As Leatherface's family taunts and threatens her, the camera holds on her increasingly frantic expressions. While the editing cuts are disorienting, rapid bursts, every time the camera cuts to her face, she's more and more unhinged, her eyes wild with fear. Her screams echo in her mind, and they stay with you. The terror here is mental, not just physical, and that's a distinction that elevates the movie. The chainsaw, a symbol of the movie's central violence, is never just a tool. It's an instrument of terror itself. Every time the chainsaw revs, it becomes a sonic weapon that amplifies the tension. The sound of it is so grating, so overwhelming, that it's almost like a character, an extension of Leatherface. And when Leatherface appears wielding it, it's a moment of pure unrelenting dread. The chainsaw is not just a tool used for gore, it's a harbinger of doom. Its revving becomes a harrowing countdown, signaling the approach of death or capture or whoever's unlucky enough to be in its path. Despite the lack of excess gore, the film is still brutally violent. In fact, it might be argued that the absence of excessive bloodshed make the violence that is shown more effective. By leaving things to the imagination, Hooper taps into something more primal and unsettling than just watching a character get brutally hacked apart on screen. The horror doesn't come from seeing violence. It comes from a slow, psychological buildup that leads to the violence, and then the consequences that follow. This is horror not from spectacle, but from atmosphere, suggestion, and raw emotional intensity. And that's the key to the scare factor of Texas Chainsaw Massacre. It doesn't need gore to be effective. What makes it terrifying is its ability to make you feel like you're trapped in the world, experiencing the terror alongside these characters. It's a movie that gets under your skin, that makes you uncomfortable and unsettled, not with what it shows, but with what it makes you feel. This is the kind of horror, the kind that lingers in the dark corners of your mind, that gives the film its staying power all these years later. So while there's gore is not graphic as some contemporaries, and definitely not as graphic as what we see today, the terror of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is no less effective. It is a brilliant example of psychological horror, where what you don't see is just as, if not more, disturbing than what's shown, and that is what makes this a true masterpiece of the genre. Alright, so let's wrap things up with some final thoughts. Simply put, in my opinion, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is nothing short of a masterpiece. It's a film that has stood the test of time, and for very good reason. In a genre that's often defined by excess, excessive gore, excessive jump scares, excessive melodrama, this film takes a more subtle and psychological approach, making it all the more terrifying in the process. It's a film that doesn't just rely on shock and gore to create fear. Instead, it pulls you into a world so nightmarish and relentless that you can't escape it no matter how hard you try. One of the most remarkable things about the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is its ability to maintain such a high level of tension without overstating the violence. The terror it delivers feels real. It feels like it could happen to you, and that's what makes it so effective. The rawness of the film, from the shaky camera work to the unpolished performances, adds an authenticity that feels almost documentary-like, and that realism only amplifies the horror. It's as if you're not just watching a movie, you're experiencing it, a terrifying nightmare right alongside these characters. And let's not forget the cultural impact. When the Texas Chainsaw Massacre was released in 1974, it shattered expectations for what horror could be. It was one of the first films to take the slasher formula and transform it into something far more unsettling and atmospheric. It introduced audiences to Leatherface, one of horror's most iconic monsters, and to a level of brutality and terror rarely seen on screen at that time. It set the bar for a whole subgenre of horror that would follow, influencing countless filmmakers, including some of the biggest names in the genre today. It's a film that changed the rules and redefined what horror could do. And yet, despite its massive influence, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre never forgets to be about what really matters in horror: the fear. The horror is grounded in something visceral, something primal. This isn't about supernatural monsters or demonic forces. This is about the true terror that can lurk within humanity itself. The Sawyers are a grotesque reflection of the darkest corners of our own society, and that's what makes them feel far more real and frightening than any ghost or dream. The film's horror is rooted in isolation, desperation, and the horrifying notion that what you fear most might be lurking just beyond your reach. On top of that, you have unforgettable performances. Marilyn Burns' Sally Hardesty delivers one of the most iconic final girl portrayals in horror history. Her terror is so palpable that you can almost feel it yourself. And then there's the Sawyer family, with each character standing out in their own right. Leatherface himself, with his disturbing appearance and terrifying unpredictability, is a figure so haunting that his presence alone makes you tense up in fear. This is a film where the characters are as important as the horror itself, and the performances give the film its emotional core. So where does that leave us? For me, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre earns a perfect score, 10 out of 10. It is, without a doubt, one of the greatest horror films ever made. It's a film that has not only held up over the years, but has only grown in stature, continuing to terrorize new generations of viewers. The film's unrelenting terror, its stark realism, and its ability to make the audience feel like they're living the horror, not just watching it, all make it an undeniable classic. And here's my recommendation. If you are a fan of horror, this film is a must-watch. But it's not just a movie, it's an experience. It's a raw, relentless journey into terror that will leave you breathless, disturbed, and haunted. If you're looking for the kind of horror that digs deep into your psyche, that keeps you on edge and questioning what you just saw, then the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is the film for you. Of course, this isn't for everyone. The raw, unpolished nature of the film and its lack of traditional gore might not sit well with those expecting something more conventional. But for those who appreciate horror at its most primal, unrefined, and real, this film is as essential as they come. So if you haven't seen it yet, now's the time. And if you've seen it before, watch it again. There's always something new to uncover in this timeless classic. All right, horror fans, now it's your turn. I want to hear from you. Did the Texas Chainsaw Massacre leave you as shaken and disturbed as it did me? Whether it was the bone-chilling tension, the unrelenting dread, or just the sheer rawness of it all. I know this film strikes a nerve with so many viewers. I'd love to hear what you thought of the film, what moments haunted you, and if there were any particular themes or characters that stood out. Was it Sally's desperate fight for survival? Or maybe the chilling, twisted nature of the Sawyer family? Whatever it was, I want to know how Texas Chainsaw Massacre left its mark on you. Feel free to share your thoughts on social media or reach out directly. I always enjoy hearing from fellow horror lovers and film lovers in general. It's great to keep the conversation going. You can find me on Instagram and Threads at RealRealTalk, where I'm always posting about upcoming episodes, horror movie news, and more. Or if you prefer a more personal touch, shoot me an email at therealrealtalk@gmail.com. I love reading your feedback and diving deeper into what makes these films so memorable. And if you have any horror movie recommendations or themes you want to hear covered, don't hesitate to send those my way too. This is all about creating a space for horror fans to connect, so your input means the world to me. Now I know you're all craving more horror, and don't worry, we're going to be back on our regular schedule Friday, continuing our dive into the world of John Carpenter. It's going to be a great one, so don't miss out. But before we go, make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. And if you enjoyed today's dive into the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, don't forget to rate and review the podcast. It really helps me out, and it shows me that you care. Once again, connect with me on Instagram and Threads at RealRealTalk for updates, sneak peeks, and join in the conversation. Drop me a line with feedback again at therealrealtalk@gmail.com. And thank you so much for tuning in to this special Christmas Eve episode of Real Real Talk Horror. Until next time, stay creepy and keep the lights on.